In this video, we're going to take a look at how the brush system works here in Substance Painter. So here I'm going to be on the base texture set. If we look at our texture set settings, here I'm on the base, and I have my layer stack. Now, just so that we can start to talk about some of the brush basics, what I'm going to do is create here a new fill layer, and so I just want to have kind of like a blank canvas. Now, this is also going to bring me to something I want to discuss. Now, notice I've added this new fill layer here. And I'll just right click to bring up the quick menu. We'll come over here to our material, and you'll notice that I have all my channels enabled, and for height, we do have a height value set at 0. However, all of the height from the layers below this fill are still being shown here. And so when you run into situations like this, you have to be aware of the blending modes for the channels below that. So for example, here we have this fill. If I set this over to my height channel, you'll notice that by default, the height channel has its blending mode set to linear dodge or add mode, which means everything is going to add up. So if we want to just completely overwrite this for this fill layer, I just need to set the blending mode to normal. Now you'll see the height information is being overwritten. Here again, I'll right click to bring up the quick view menu. We'll look at our material, and here I have my height value set to 0, so it's being overwritten by this 0 height value, which is exactly what we want. Now, I still see some ambient occlusion, so we want to do the same thing with that. So we'll go to ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion defaults to multiply, so here I just want to set this to normal, again, just to overwrite everything. So now I'm just using this fill layer as just a simple blank canvas, and also wanted to illustrate how you have to be aware of these blending modes and what they're set to for each channel. Okay, so now we want to get into painting. So in order to paint, I need to create a standard paint layer. Here on the toolbar, I have the brush tool activated, and at the top of the UI, I have controls for my brush, such as size, flow, and stroke opacity. And so a standard layer is what we are allowed to paint on. Now we also have our properties. So again, like I said in earlier videos, this is context sensitive. So if I open my properties, you can see now that we have brush properties, we have properties for setting an alpha, we also have a second screen space mask that we can use in the form of a stencil, and then here we have the material properties. So with a brush, you're always going to have your brush, which is defined by the brush settings, alpha for the tip, and so on, and then you're also going to have a corresponding material associated with that. Now what I'm going to do is just close this property, and to work with my brush, I'm actually just going to use the right-click context menu so that I can quickly navigate to my brush settings. This provides a quick, easy way to get to your brush settings without having to clutter the UI with a bunch of open panels. Alright, so now that we have this open, let's come over here to our material, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to enable just my color, my roughness, and my height. So let's set a color. Let's use something like red just so we can really see what we're doing. For the roughness, I'm going to keep it pretty low. And then here for the height, I'm going to set here just a positive value for this height. So now here in the 3D view, I'm going to start to paint. So as I start to paint my stroke, you can see that we're actually painting across all of the channels that we had enabled. So Substance Painter is multi-channel when it comes to painting. So here we'll zoom in, I can move my light around, and you can see that we actually painted some height information. We painted our rough information as well as that red color. So here I'm just going to hit Control Z to undo that stroke. If I would like, I can right click, go back to my brush settings here, and I can do things like adjust my size, flow, stroke opacity, spacing, and so on. I can also do that, like I said earlier, here from the top of the menu. However, the easiest way to do this is to use a couple keyboard shortcuts here as you paint. So what I'm going to do is increase my brush size by using the keyboard shortcut, which is the Control key and the right mouse button, and then move it left to right, and you see here that I can quickly control or set the size of my brush. So Control Z, I'm going to undo that stroke. So here I'll set my size. Now, if I hold down the Control key, right mouse button, and move up and down, you can see that I can change the hardness of the alpha. So here I'll paint a new stroke, and this is the result. So Control Z to undo that. Let's adjust our alpha again, increase our brush size. Now, the next keyboard shortcut that you're going to need to use is for the flow. So here, if I hold down the Control key, the left mouse button, and move left to right, I can adjust the actual flow. Here at the top of the UI, you can see that the slider is being set here for me via the keyboard shortcut. So now let me right click again to bring up my brush menu, and we can also take a look at some of these jitter settings here. So I could set some jitter settings such as my size, let's set a flow, a position jitter, and this window here is giving me a preview of what this brush is going to look like. While I'm setting up my brush, I can also paint in this window to get just a quick preview of what this brush settings are going to do. So now that I have this, let's come back here to the mesh, decrease the size of my brush, and now I'm going to start to paint. And now you can see that I'm getting kind of like this spray paint type effect just by changing those jitter settings for my brush. So here I'll hit Control Z, let's right click, and here these are the jitter settings that I had just set. Now you can also save brush presets, and with Substance Painter we ship with several of these presets in the shelf. So let's come over here to our dock, let's open up our shelf, and I'm going to tear this off, and I'm actually going to come all the way over here to the left side of the UI and dock the shelf here. And so now you can see that here in my brushes category I have a lot of these preset brushes that we ship with in Substance Painter. Here, if we look at the category section, I don't really need this for now, so I'm going to close this out by clicking this folder icon. And now I have just my brushes that I want to work with. So here I have my layers, my brushes. I can use my right-click menu to quickly get to any settings that I need, such as my material. And this sets me up with a nice environment for just painting. All right, so let's now use one of our dirt brushes. So I'm going to come over here to my brushes, and I'm just going to select this dirt brush. And now you can see that this is, well, if I right-click and look at my settings here, this is going to set some parameters here for things like the jitter. It's also, if I come over here to my alpha button, it's also going to set a dirt alpha as well. So like I said, these are just preset brushes, and of course you can save your own. All right, so let's take a look at what this brush is doing. So Control, right mouse button, left to right is going to control my size. And now I can just come in and start to paint. And so this is what this paintbrush is doing. Again, I'm still painting across my color, my roughness, and my height channel. Here I might right click, come over to my material, we'll come over to height, let's lower that value, and now I'll come back and I'll start to paint, and now I'm just painting in negative height information here, so I'm kind of like cutting into the surface. Now we can undo these strokes, but we also have a history palette here in the dock as well. So if I open the history, you can see everything that I've been working on. So I can go back to this layer here. So I have an add stroke, here's another stroke. I'm just going to go back to the add layer. So this will take me back to kind of that default state. Here I'm going to go back to this default soft brush. Now if you're using a Wacom tablet, you're going to want to be able to use pen pressure. So here, if we just right click, come over here to our brush settings, you'll notice that things like the size is going to have the ability to work with pen pressure or no pressure. So here I could enable pen pressure for my size as well as for my flow. So flow and size are now being driven by the pen pressure. And here we also have your stroke opacity, which is going to allow us to build up paint. So I'm not using a Wacom tablet right here, but if we lower our stroke opacity, you'll notice here now that I can start to paint and just start to build up as I paint over each stroke. Now, if you have stroke opacity enabled and you want to be able to paint, but you want to temporarily block the buildup, what you can do is as you paint, use the keyboard shortcut, you can hold down the A key, and now as I paint my stroke, you can see that it's not building up as I continue to paint across this stroke. If I release the A key, now I'm starting to build up that stroke information yet again. So here I'll hit Control Z just to undo that. Well, actually here, let's just come back over to our history. And you'll see all these strokes we added. Let's just go back to our add layer. So let me hit my right click menu again. Let's go to our stroke opacity and set that all the way to 100. And I'm going to decrease my size here. Now we also have this lazy mouse setting as well. So say I start to paint a stroke and I want to try to make the curve really nice and smooth. So what I can do is come over here in the UI and activate lazy mouse. Now you'll notice that we have our stroke, but then we have this dark circle outside of it, and that's going to just define that lazy fall off amount. So now you'll notice as I start to paint my stroke, the stroke is actually following just the outside of that dark circle like this here. And we can adjust this by using our distance setting. So it's going to make it smaller, or we can increase it like this here. So that's how you work with lazy mouse here inside of Substance Painter. So we'll just disable lazy mouse for now, and let me just undo those strokes. If you need to paint with symmetry, we also have a symmetry option. So if I enable symmetry here, you can see that we have a symmetry plane, and as I start to paint my stroke, we now have symmetrical strokes. Here we can set the mirror X, Y, or Z axis, depending on what axis we want to work with. And then also right next to that is an option to either hide or show that symmetry plane. So the next feature I'd like to discuss here is going to be this follow path. So again, right click to open up my menu, and you see that we have this follow path. So to illustrate this, what I'm going to do is add a new alpha. So I'm still just using that default brush preset, which again is just a preset that sets up the brush settings for me. And now I'm going to come over here to my alpha tab, and I'm going to choose a new alpha. So I'm just going to click the alpha button. This is going to open up my mini shelf, which is already filtered to all the alphas. And let's just grab an alpha like this arrow simple. So now I have this arrow. Let's come back here to my 3D view where I can start to paint. Now, another keyboard shortcut that I want to tell you about, if we hold down the control key and the left mouse button and move up and down, we can rotate the alpha. Okay, so here, one last thing I need to set. Let's come back here to our brush settings, and let's come over to our spacing, and I'm going to increase the spacing here for this. Okay, so now I have some spacing. If I start to paint my stroke, you can see that the alpha is not really following that stroke. So that's what I can use follow path for. So let's right click and let's scroll down to where we have follow path. I'm going to enable this here. Now, as I start to paint my stroke, you can see that the arrow is now following my stroke. Here, just to better illustrate this, let's come back here to our brush settings. Let me decrease that spacing a little bit. And now I'll start to paint. And here you can see again that arrow is just following the path of my stroke. Now, to get even better result out of that, I probably want to come over here to my angle and just set that to 0. So now when we look, you can see that we're really getting the result that we want to have here, where the alpha is being rotated to follow my stroke path. So at this stage, we've gone in and we've set some settings for our brush. We have follow path enabled, and we've set a custom alpha. And let's say that this is a preset we want to be able to save. Well, we can do that from the brush properties. Now, we can't do it here from the quick menu, so I'm just going to left click out in the viewport to close that. I'm going to come over here to my brush properties, and here I'm just going to right click, and you'll see I have some options to create a tool preset, a material preset, or a brush preset. In my case, I want to create a brush preset. So we'll choose create brush preset. And then here in the shelf, you can see my new preset is enabled. So for example, if I go back to say something like this mold, so now I have a mold brush. And then here, if I go back to my new brush preset, now I have my brush preset that we just created here. Now, the difference between these options, for a brush preset, it is just saving the brush settings. So my brush, follow path, the jitter, my alpha, just those settings here, as well as the stencil if I'm using one. But it's not saving the material at all. So the material is still the red and my roughness and my height, just because it's just retaining what I had set before. Let's say that I want to save everything, like the brush setting and the material all together. What I'm going to do is save this as a tool. So a tool represents brush settings as well as material settings together. So we'll choose create tool, and you can see here in the shelf we have a tool. If I open up the categories here, you'll see there's a tools category, and now we've saved this new tool. So for example, if I come back here to this material, and let's say that I turn off all these channels here, and we'll set this to a different color, something like this here. And now if I activate my tool, you can see that again it automatically enables the channels that we had previously, as well as all of the brush settings. And then the last option here was create a material preset. That's if we have just a basic material preset that we want to be able to use. Here, if we look at our material category, which is here, if we save a material preset here, you can see it's just going to show up as this new material. All right, so that takes care of saving tools and presets. So for now, I'm going to come back to my brushes, and I'm just going to use this default hard brush. Let me come over here to my history, and let me just go back to this add layer. So we'll just clear everything out. And so I'm going to zoom in, and here we have these two planes. Now you'll notice that the brush tip is aligning itself to the tangent of the mesh. That's how the brushing system works by default here in Substance Painter. Substance Painter is a 3D brush system. So against these two planes here, and I know I have a texture seam, if I just left click on this, you can see that here we have our stroke, and it's actually doing this. We have a stroke was placed here, and then it's doing a wrap here to the other plane, like you see like this. So if I right click here to come over to my brush settings, and I'm just going to scroll down to the alignment, you can see that by default, this is the behavior you're going to get. It's set to tangent, which is based on the tangent of the mesh, and mode is set to wrap. So let's say we change this from tangent to planar. So let's see what this stroke gives us this time. So again, here, let me just try to set the brush about the same size. Let's come over here into this section, and I'm going to just do another left click to apply a stroke. And now here's the difference that we're getting here. So now we're doing, we're using the tangent, but now you can see that if I place my brush tip here, planar projection, and so this is where we're getting kind of this fall off, a little bit of a smear here. So that's the difference between wrap and planar. And again, wrap is what's enabled by default. Okay, so let's right click, and this time let's set this to camera. So now the brush system is going to be using the camera of the viewport to set the projection for the stroke. You'll notice here that the stroke no longer is aligning to the tangent of the mesh. So now, here, let's do the same stroke kind of in the same area here. So I'll left click to stamp, and so this is kind of what I'm getting. You see that there's a bit of a fall off from here to here. Whoops, there's a bit of a fall off here and here. Now if I set my angle, maybe something more like this, and we do a stroke, now we're getting something like this here, and so on. So camera is going to take the actual viewport angle for the projection. All right, so we'll undo these strokes here. Now, up until this point, we've been working solely here with a 3D view. However, Substance Painter also has a 2D view. So here at the top of the menu, on the far right, here, if we click this button, you can see that we have the 3D only view, 2D only, or 3D 2D split. So let's go into the 3D 2D split view. So this gives us a 2D view, and we can navigate this view the same way, same keyboard shortcuts that we're using to navigate the 3D view. So just to make sure on my settings here, let's take our alignment and let's set this back here to tangent wrap. Okay, so if I zoom in here in the 2D view, you can see that I have these UV shells. Now, if I start to paint across this UV shell, you can see that what Painter's going to do is it's going to continue that stroke across that discontinuous UV edge. And so by doing this, you'll end up not getting any seams as you paint. So here, let me undo that stroke, and you'll see here that here as I paint in the 3D view, the stroke is trying to align itself to its corresponding UV edge. However, there may be a time when you don't want that behavior. So here, we'll undo these strokes. If I right click here, and if we set our alignment mode to UV, so now in UV mode, if I come back and I start to paint my stroke, you can see that the stroke is going to be contained within the UV shell that I'm painting on. So it's not going to try to match that discontinuous UV edge. So seamless painting works for camera, tangent wrap, and tangent planar. And UV is just for painting in the UV space. All right, so let's switch our view back here to our 3D only view. And I'll right click to come up here to my menu again. Let's change our alignment back to tangent wrap. And here you'll notice that we have this back face, culling, and size space. So let's just take a look at this size space option. You'll notice here that we have object, viewport, and texture. So here, if it's set to object and I set a brush size, you can see that as I zoom in, the brush is pretty much the same size comparably. And if I zoom out, the brush is staying the same size. So let's say I zoom out to here and I create a stamp, and I zoom in, not changing my brush size, create another stamp. Here you can see that the size is basically the same. Now, if we right click and I set this mode here to say something like viewport, now the viewport is going to dictate the size of the brush. So let's say I zoom out, you'll notice the brush size is pretty big, so I'll stamp here. Now let's zoom in, we'll come over. Now you can see that as I zoom in, the brush size is becoming smaller, and now I get a different result. So here you can use these size spaces to control the size of the brush as you zoom in and out. So object is going to be based on the object, viewport is going to be on the viewport, and texture is going to be based on UV space. The next thing I want to cover is how you can mask a stroke. So if I right click here, you can see that we have this culling option, and it's enabled by default set to 90. Now here on my mesh, you can see that I have this 90-degree angle. And so if I start to just place a stroke here, you can see that again, that the stroke is just wrapping from one plane to the next. So if I wanted to mask that stroke, I could use this culling option. So what I'm going to do is just lower this down below 90. And now if I come in and I just paint my stroke across, you can see that it's now masking. So here I'm just going to undo this stroke. And another feature that we have is the ability to draw perfectly straight lines. So here I'm going to left click to create a stroke, hold down my shift key, and now you can see that I'm getting this line here. And this is going to help me to draw just a straight line all the way across. So here I'll draw out my stroke, I'll left click again, and now I have a straight line by using the line tool, again activated with the shift key. The last thing I want to cover is how the stencil works on the brush. So if I right click here and I'll start to just scroll down, you can see that we have this stencil option. Now the stencil option is going to provide us with a secondary screen space mask. So here what I'm going to do is come over here to my brushes, and I'm going to select this Dirt 1 brush. So here you can see that again it sets my brush settings. We now have this alpha dirt here, and now we have this stencil. So without the stencil, I come into here and I start to paint. Okay, we're just painting. Now, I'll right click again, I'll come over here to my stencil, and I'm going to click the stencil button. And I'm going to load in some type of texture. It could be a texture, an alpha, or a procedural. Here, let's just use this double arrow. And so here in the 3D view, you can see the stencil. Now to operate the stencil, you hold down the S key on the keyboard. So here, let me just left click to get rid of the quick view window. I'm going to hold down the S key. Here in the bottom left of the viewport, you can see the keyboard shortcuts to navigate the stencil tool. So the S with the right mouse button is going to zoom in and out. The S key with the left mouse button is going to rotate. And the S key with the middle mouse button is going to pan. So with this, I can set up my stencil, and then I can start to paint, and you can see now, again, the stencil's just working like a screen space mask. If we come over here to our display settings, and here we'll use the viewport display settings, here we have an option to hide stencil when painting, so that's enabled by default. So again, if let's just rotate our mesh around, let's grab our stencil, so the S key, middle mouse button, I'm just going to pan over, and as I start to paint, you can see the stencil disappears. So let me just undo that, and then I'm going to uncheck this hide stencil when painting. So now I can see the stencil as I paint through it here in the viewport. Here I'll undo this again, and then also we have this stencil opacity. So here we can just make an adjustment to that opacity setting. So typically I kind of like to leave the hide stencil when painting deactivated so that I can see my stencil here as I paint. So S key, I'm going to rotate my stencil. Again, with the S key still held down, I can use my keyboard shortcuts, left mouse button to rotate, middle to pan, right to zoom in and out to place the stencil, and now I can just paint right here in the viewport. So that's going to take care of our walkthrough through the brush system. In the next video, we're going to use the brush system with paint effects, projections, as well as cloning.